that German leadership was already missing during the last 3 years. A new word has been coined, which is called the German vote, which means abstention. And the German ambassador to the European Union had to write a kind of open letter back to Berlin saying, putting me into an impossible situation because I have no position to defend. And the reason is that the governing parties were very much aligned on issues of culture, like, say, same-sex marriage or cannabis and so on, but completely opposed on all things economic. And that's why they collapsed after only 3 years. So I think if you're looking for German leadership, that collapse is rather a good news because there will be new elections. And very likely there will be a two-party government with CDU, CSU, and either the Greens or the Social Democrats. And I think you will be getting that leadership which you're asking for.
And that's not due for another few months, couple of months, February. In the interim, given what we're about to expect with Donald Trump in the White House, the potential escalation again of the situation in Ukraine, what would you advise the German government to do, or what would you advise Europe to do in the absence of strong German leadership?
Fortunately, we had strong German leadership in the person of Ursula von der Leyen. Because when Germany wanted to send 5,000 helmets and France really didn't engage, she engaged, and we had the first sanctions packages after 2 days, and altogether 11 sanction packages. So I think that leadership is still there. That leadership has just been re-elected. There's a fresh team of commissioners. And if I understand her correctly, she has a couple of issues where she is deeply personally motivated to succeed. One is Ukraine, and maybe it's the number one. It's also enlargement. It's also climate change. So I think the continuity in Europe will come less from the governing side, which are in trouble, which are in crisis. We are looking at France these days. But the continuity is coming from the European Commission under the leadership of Ursula von der Leyen.
Do you believe then, with a new government in place, the situation will change dramatically regarding the support for Ukraine, military support for Ukraine, specifically Taurus missiles and the use of them in Russian territory? We don't even know the context of the Ukraine war by February, but do you think that will change, and do you think that has to change? Is that a mistake by Olaf Scholz?
The leader of the German opposition of the CDU-CSU, Friedrich Merz, has said he would allow Taurus missiles to be delivered. Of course, it will not be a one-party government. It will be probably a two-party government, CDU-CSU plus Social Democrats or plus the Greens. And I believe if it were to be an alliance with the Greens, Germany would more strongly engage, including Taurus missiles. The Social Democrats have a problem because their parliamentary group leader is also the leader, you could say, of the pacifist faction. And therefore, Olaf Scholz always had to do a balancing act with the left wing of his party. And he's the chancellor from Hamburg. And he might remember another chancellor from Hamburg, Helmut Schmidt, who was finally brought down by the pacifist at the time when he tried 40 years ago to deploy nuclear weapons in Germany of mid-range. So I think he's playing a very careful balancing act with the pacifist wing and his own readiness to engage. And the Social Democrats therefore present more limitations to engagement in Ukraine than the Christian Democrats and the Greens would do, because the Greens have a very principled approach.
Chancellor Merkel, in her autobiography, has defended her position as Chancellor in relation to accessing cheap energy from Russia, gas and oil and so on. What's your own feeling around this? Because that's something that Germany's been heavily criticised for, because it was despite all the clear warning signs around Crimea, Georgia, and interference in European and American elections.
I do not agree that Angela Merkel is singled out on this issue, because if you have a closer look, Poland was completely dependent on Russian gas. Czech Republic was completely dependent. Slovakia was completely dependent. Hungary was completely dependent. Austria is still completely dependent, more or less, and Germany was. It didn't start with Merkel, it started before. It didn't end with Merkel, it just ended because of the Ukraine war. So I think to see there a personal responsibility of Angela Merkel would not be correct. I've always been more a fan of Helmut Kohl than of Angela Merkel, but to criticize her for this, I think, would not be correct. And we also have to see this government, which wanted to do everything better, collapsed after 3.5 years. She successfully led a coalition government for 16 years, so I think we have to see her merits as well.
Because the Baltic countries would say that they sounded clear warnings to Germany, to the European Union over the past decade about a codependent or an interdependent relationship with Russia vis-à-vis energy. Would you then argue that that wasn't the case?
I think they were very clear, and I think we should have listened more. And the Baltic countries have the advantage that they had to live in the Soviet Union. And when I say live in the Soviet Union, this is too nice a word. Many of them were deported to Siberia. Yeah. We had an EPP group vice president who was born in the Gulag. This was an attempt for genocide, you could say, for national extinction. And still they survived and they imposed themselves and they became very important members of the European Union. And that's why I think it's a very wise decision to now have given the new brief for Defense Commissioner to Andrius Kubilius, because he knows that if he doesn't succeed that, he might bring his own country into trouble. He's got a lot of experience. He was twice prime minister of his country. And the combination of that with an Estonian high representative and a Finnish vice president who was working with them in a team, I think is a very clear signal that at least now the danger that's posed by Russia is clearly understood.
How do you assess the situation we're in now in relation to Russia when you're talking about an escalation, at least 10,000 North Korean troops, it's been Iranian support, Chinese support for Russia, and huge criticism around the European Union about what the future holds with regard to joint procurement and supporting each other around defence. Are we heading in the right direction? Because the discussion doesn't seem to be in any advanced way when it comes to defence bonds. How do you see things are? Are we in serious trouble?
Our president of the Martin Center, Mikyas Jorinda, asked us 2 years ago to work on the defense issue, and I've volunteered to coordinate that project, and we came up with a 10-point plan to build up a European defense. And many things can be done which are absolutely normal. We can spend more money on military mobility. We do already, but we need to spend much more. We can invest much more money into research for dual-use products, for example. We can work on how would we deal with a catastrophe, not just wildfires, but military war. We needed to update our institutional infrastructure, for example. And we are seeing already progress. So we've been asking with the Martin Center 1.5 years ago for Commissioner for Defense. And we now have a Commissioner for Defense. We've been asking for more money for military mobility. And the European Commission decided 2 weeks ago that unused funds from regional funds can now be used for military mobility. That's huge. And the Defense Commissioner, Andrius Kubilius, has proposed that we should get, as we had suggested, an EU DARPA, so like the Americans are having, so that we can compete also technologically. So I'm rather positive that not starting with the army, not starting with men in uniform, but that all the preconditions are built which allow us to raise the question, let's say, of our own defense in Europe in a more convincing way, and also meet legitimate demands by our partners, for example, in the United States. And when you come to financing, I think that the defense needs are so urgent, especially if Russia should continue to produce at the scale they are currently producing, even after a potential ceasefire in Ukraine, that we cannot wait for individual countries to find the money. I think defense might be the one area where, in fact, we could go for European debt, but then not just as a target, then for precise projects, let's say a European air defense that's protecting all of us. And the good thing would also be that then all the member states would equally participate in the financing of European defense. Because sometimes still some people believe Russia is a problem in the East. And that's absolutely wrong. Russia is also a major problem in Syria, which is in the southeast. Russia has now caused 2 major waves of migration, which is destabilizing our political system, first from Syria and then from Ukraine. And Russia is also a major challenge in the south. Nowadays, Russia is more or less controlling militarily governments in the Sahel zone from the very west to the very east, which gives them the possibility to destabilize Northern Africa, and with Northern Africa potentially also Southern Europe, whenever they want. So Russia is a challenge in the east, in the southeast, and in the south. And to be honest, you're Irish. I think the times when Ireland could just relax and say, look, we don't have to participate in these defense activities because we are very well protected, very well covered. The Irish economy defense depends on undersea cables with the United States. And we've now seen several attempts, the last one between Germany and Finland, to destroy this infrastructure. So I think it's also time that Ireland deeply reflects how it can defend its vital economic, political and military interests.
And have you had that conversation with your Fine Gael members here, or members of the European People's Party? I mean, that's obviously the party that's been in government for 14 years, and there has been no development on this issue. In fact, we just had a general election and actually don't think it was mentioned.
Yeah, if I'm correctly informed, then the outgoing Irish government started a kind of popular consultation on the issue of defense. And the first reaction it got from the people was pretty hostile, saying we don't need that, we don't need to go there. But I'm not sure that this position can hold. I think that position cannot hold. I think the new government, where I believe Fine Gael will again play a prominent role, has come in second in the elections after Fianna Fáil, with whom it has formed a governing part. The government only 2 seats short of the majority of 88 seats in the Gael. I believe over the course of that mandate, this government will also need to address issues of defence.
Do you think Ireland will come under some pressure from member states, from Coreper or the Council or the Commission in this regard? Because it seems to be quite light touch.
I don't think it will come under pressure, but I think it might have to reconsider its own vital interests. And whereas we used to believe that, that territorial position behind Britain and in the Atlantic that gave you a lot of protection, maybe Ireland is finding out that this is giving a lot of vulnerability as well.
I mean, on that issue as well, not just Ireland, but EU unity, are you confident that we are going to be unified in this confrontation with Russia for the next few years? When you look at the hostility when it comes to, let's say, NATO membership for Ukraine, or even Ukrainian membership of the European Union from countries like Hungary, Slovakia, when you have unanimity at the table, of the voting table. I mean, this is going to be problematic over the next while.
I'm encouraged by the record of the European Union on Ukraine. The first sanction package was passed after 2 days, which is amazing. Altogether, 11 sanction packages were passed. Within, I think, 2 weeks, the Ukrainian energy net was linked to the continental energy net. We've been very helpful on grain exports and so on, and all this was possible together in the European Union. So I think the track record is rather positive. But also more recently, if I have a look at the vote in the European Parliament on financing Ukraine with the receipts of Russian assets which were frozen, there was a nearly 90% majority in the House, from the very left to the very right. With the sovereignists out, yes, that's true, and the Patriots split. but a huge sign of solidarity to vote this with nearly 90% of the House. So I believe the support in Europe is holding, the support in the European Union is holding. Of course, we might see an acceleration of events which is testing our resolve again. In case Donald Trump should be successful with his push for Russia and Ukraine to agree on a ceasefire, in case they should do that, the next day the question will be on the table: who is guaranteeing the sovereignty of the free part of Ukraine, which is still about 80%. And I think that question will be directed rather to the Europeans than to the Americans.
Indeed. On that issue, what do you see from a logical point of view, what is workable in terms of not Ukraine giving up territory per se, but having areas temporarily occupied, that could mean an end to the war, that Ukraine could move towards NATO membership? What would you say is a sort of a logical outcome?
I spent some couple of weeks ago, again another week in the United States, in New York, discussing also with experts on the American Council on Foreign Relations and with others. And it appears to me that the most likely scenario is that a kind of ceasefire will be agreed. Ukraine will not agree to cede territory, but it will have to accept that for a time which is unknown, this territory is under foreign control, under Russian control. And that to a certain extent is similar to the situation of West Germany and East Germany. So West Germany was free, West Germany was democratic, but the East was occupied by the Soviet Union. But we never gave up the hope, the vision, the desire to see the country reunified. We had to wait 40 years until 1989, and finally it happened when the right moment was there. But this meant that West Germany was safe. We had American troops, we had British troops, we had French troops. So I think what Ukraine can legitimately demand is that it will also be safe. And I personally do not believe that it can be safe without the support also of foreign troops in its own territory. And I believe that's most likely going to be European troops.
America would say, yes, not American troops, it would just be very specifically European troops that would guard territory within Ukraine that would be covered by a NATO security guarantee. Is that what you're saying?
I believe the Americans are focusing more and more on China. And I believe also they expect, with some justification, that Europeans take more responsibility for the security on their own continent. And I think that's what we have to do. And the way to do that in an efficient way is to strengthen cooperation in the European Union and between the European Union and NATO. And there cannot be a successful economic development in the free part of Ukraine without proper security. And those security guarantees cannot be the securities guarantees of the Budapest Memorandum. We all know the value of that, which was, let's say, very close to zero. So an end of hostilities will need a real engagement for the security of the free part of Ukraine. It will need helping them on their way, on their path to the European Union, because otherwise also there will be no foreign investment in Ukraine, which is desperately needed. But let's not forget also that Ukraine has a lot to offer. We should not just think about it like we are giving to Ukraine and Ukraine is just on the receiving end. It has a wonderfully educated population, especially the young ones. I've been in Ukraine during the war 3 times, twice in Kiev and one in Lviv. In Lviv, at the law school of the Catholic University. And you can see these are top educated young people, which would all help us as well in what we are doing. And also Ukraine is incredibly raw material rich. It's only 0.5% of the surface of the earth, but they have 4.6% of the raw materials. That means 9 times more than what would be logical. So if we are speaking about strategic sovereignty, becoming less dependent on foreign countries, becoming less dependent on China, I think Ukraine is a good part of the answer to that issue.
I mean, you mentioned there the various ill-fated peace agreements with Russia of recent years. In what way do you think that Vladimir Putin would agree to this negotiated outcome that wouldn't just lead to further intervention? Or why would he agree to it in the first place?
Of course, it's speculation, but I think we are seeing these days that Russia is overstretched as well. I mean, they already could not intervene in favor of Armenia when Azerbaijan was taking back Nagorno-Karabakh. So it kind of failed in the security guarantees it was expected to give. And we are now seeing that they are very weak in Syria as well. So the Syrian regime is not only weakened because of the weakening of Hezbollah, but they're also weakened because Russia cannot really come to their rescue. And that's not just an issue of Syria, because Syria is also the Mediterranean harbor for Russia. And it's also the airfield from which they are doing the provisions for Africa. So if Syria should fall, and if Russia should not be able to maintain its harbor and its airfield, it will be significantly reduced in the Mediterranean, and its Africa policy will be in shambles. So also Russia is overstretched, and it has to take a decision whether it can afford to continue this war, not only economically, but also from its own ambition as a big power. Maybe some more fundamental point is the following. The Russian people are proud people. They will not be happy over the long time to become a raw material colony of China. And that's what they are about to become. China has not yet finalized the agreement on the delivery of gas from northern Siberia to China because they want the prices to go further down. Prices to go further down might mean that Russia has to sell below the cost of production. That's what's called a colonial exploitation. So can Russia, which is a proud country, can they accept to become a raw material colony of China? I don't think so. So I believe it's in Russia's self-interest to not just have one client and one customer for their raw material or for their gas, but to become a more respected part of the global order and global economy again.
But what would be the off-ramp for Vladimir Putin to agree to that? Because this sounds like a victory for Ukraine, somewhat of a victory for Ukraine. You're not giving up permanently or formally territory with the view to taking it back within a certain amount of time. Greater Russia hasn't been recreated. Putin has failed. NATO has expanded. Why would he agree to this, notwithstanding all the important points you made about Russian influence in Syria and Africa being under threat?
I mean, Russia, when they started the war, were hoping for a very quick victory. A week, 4 weeks. That is clearly not the case. They probably have lost by now 200,000 Russian people, which is a lot. Russia already has a demographic problem, which is major. So they also have limitations, which is, by the way, why they're bringing in North Koreans to die for them, or why they've been using very much national minorities to die for them. So Russia will want to negotiate at least a partial lifting of the sanctions. That might be on the plus side. But I think they will also be confronted by a tough position of the United States. You don't sit seriously on the negotiation table. They might double their deliveries to Ukraine. And the nomination of General Keith Kellogg as the chief negotiator or the chief, strategist on the issue is a very good sign, because he's a Russia hawk. He's not a Russia friend. He's a Russia hawk. He has been very outspoken on Ukraine. He published a paper on Ukraine a couple of months ago, which is really worth reading. It's kind of funny paper because 95% of the text he's criticizing Biden, and he says, well, why MAGA was right. But when you read the last paragraphs, it's tough on Russia and it's good for Ukraine. So he's been mandated, and I think that's a very strong signal that the United States is not just going to abandon Ukraine, but they will also put very serious pressure on Putin to sit on the table.
Because some of the appointments are slightly mixed messages, like Tulsi Gabbard, for example. She would be no friend of Ukraine.
Yeah, I think it remains a bit to be seen what's happening. Maybe some of the nominations were made to please a certain part of his audience, but he also knows that they have to go through the Senate. And the nomination of Matt Gaetz, I think, did hold for a couple of days. Then he was gone. I'm not sure that all the other nominations will come true. And if the lady would be nominated, I think it would also pose very serious difficulties for the Five Eye Cooperation. Are the British really going to give sensitive information into that network if they can't trust the head of the CIA? I seriously doubt it. And the same is true for Australia, Canada, and New Zealand.
Okay, so just, I suppose, in a word to wrap up, and we're coming into the new White House in January. We know that Donald Trump had a conversation with Mark Rutte, Secretary General of NATO, and the message was that Europe needs to do a lot more, but we know that anyway. Are you optimistic about the road ahead, even though we have no really idea what's facing us? But give us some idea, some explanation as to why you might take some solace or heart that Europe can get through this.
The first thing is, I believe we should be less fixated on foreign countries, foreign leaders, including Donald Trump. The key thing is to bring our own house in order. We have to be concerned if we are weak. So that's what we have to address first. We have to stop our weaknesses, and that's the case both in the economy, and I think the Draghi plan is giving a good outline what needs to be done. And it's also the case in defense, where the Martin Center presented a 10-step plan to go forward. And if we address, let's say, those weaknesses and become much stronger, which we normally do under pressure, it's a prime opportunity to do that now. Maybe an additional element. I don't believe that Donald Trump is an ideologue at all. There are many ideologues around him, but he's basically a deal maker. So what they try to do is to get cost off the American balance sheet and onto other people's shoulders. For example, in defense. For example, say, look, we might impose tariffs and then we can lower our own taxation. Basically like an old-fashioned trade unionist who is saying, look, we would like to have a 15% salary increase so that at the end there's going to be 5% as the outcome. I don't believe for a second that they will impose 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, but he wants the southern border of Mexico to be better controlled. So in the conversation of Europe, I believe one of the things seriously to be discussed will be our common approach towards China. So we will then see how much of the talk on tariffs is real and how much is in effect an old-style trade unionist approach to getting some of the issues better aligned.
Okay, well, Klaus Feller, Chairman of the Academic Council of the Martin Center, thank you very much for joining us at the Europe Conversation. We really appreciate it. That was fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
And I hand you back to Anna.